So in Pennsylvania, ultimately, the effort to prevent enforcement of the mail-in voting requirements was denied. So the enforcement will actually occur. There's still other cases out there, backlogs of voter registration that hasn't been followed through on in some different counties that is being highlighted by Scott Pressler.
If I could stop you just on the Pennsylvania one, the enforcement is going to occur, which means that it needs to be properly dated on the outside of the envelope, failing which it's not. There was two types. It was not, is it a rejected that cannot be cured, correct?
Right. That there's a certain way that you have to do a mail-in voting, and you're going to have to comply with it in Pennsylvania. In Michigan, that means they have to check the signatures before they open the ballot and follow proper signature matching protocol before they do it, despite the efforts of the Secretary of State to negate that. You still have, in Arizona, they're going to allow the illegals to stay on there. All we know is that they're people that didn't have proof of citizenship. That's not a guarantee that they're illegals. But you could raise a reasonable inference that at least some of them are. And your method for making sure they're not was never properly substantiated. What has come out since then is there was a great efforts by the Arizona political hierarchy, including apparently the governor's office and the Secretary of State's office, to hide this fact from the American public once they found out about it, once they internally found out about this problem. I mean, what's extraordinary is you have people like Garrett Archer, who's a data analyst, election analyst, used to work with a lot of the Arizona election officials, now as a commentator. And, on some stuff we agree. He agrees about the importance of signature matches, for example. But on other issues, he keeps being very dismissive of these other challenges. So, for example, in Alabama, Oklahoma, they went through and made sure people who are not citizens were not on their voter rolls. People who are dead were not on their voter rolls. The Biden Justice Department is trying to interfere and require those names go back on the voter rolls. And the excuse is that within 90 days, they can't do a voter purge under a certain federal law interpretation. The problem with all of this, and the other argument that he makes and some others make on their behalf, is that there's some constitutional right to vote by mail. There's a constitutional right to vote once that's given to you by the state. And that depends on the state. As people sometimes forget, that's up to the legislature of the state in presidential elections. There's no U.S. constitutional right to vote in the presidential election. That's entirely up to the state legislature, who's given exclusive and absolute authority about how electors are chosen for the presidential election. Now, once the state gives it to you, then there's due process principles that apply. That was the debated issue in Bush v. Gore as to whether the state was following those due process principles. However, it has always been the case that voting by mail is a privilege. Even in a state that gives you the right to vote is the right to vote in person, and is protected thereby. The right to vote by some mechanism other than in person has always been recognized as a privilege, and in part that's because of unique risks present of that vote not being a constitutionally honest vote, meaning you're a constitutionally qualified voter is determined by the rules of the state legislature in a presidential election, that the method by which you're voting is constitutionally qualified, and that the counting and canvassing of the vote is also constitutionally qualified. People have sued on these grounds before, saying, I should have the right to vote by mail. And it's always been rejected. There's no such right to vote by mail. So, people like Archer are, frankly, he accuses other people of being misleading. He's being misleading. He might want to stay out of the legal world because some of his he's so eager to defend the administrative election bureaucracy that he embraces some statements that are just not accurate, either factually or about the law. I mean, it was amazing. I think he said that there was no evidence of any administrative errors in the election bureaucracy a couple of weeks ago. And then all of a sudden it came out, oh, by the way, there's 100,000 people who don't have citizenship qualification or illegally registered in Arizona. Oops. And then what's his excuse? Well, some of them may be legal voters, so they're entitled to be registered. No, they're not. Again, the having proof of citizenship is not a burdensome requirement for the exercise of voting privileges in a state.
But I gotta ask this.
With it doesn't violate due process.
Robert, this is from the Arizona. I don't understand what the glitch is, but it said, what the glitch was. It said they were allegedly supposed to have showed proof of citizenship when they applied for the driver's license from which they're pulling the roll, but they might not have. And then they say the issue only affects a fraction of the 4.1 million registered to vote, some 98,000. The difference in Arizona last election was under 11,000.
Exactly. And they were saying that this couldn't happen. And then, oh, oops, yes, it does happen. And so I think we'll see what the courts do. You're seeing the Democratic courts trying to interfere, and intervene in the election pretty consistently. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court, the Democratic oriented court, walked back from the breach on that, but other courts are making all kinds of nutty rulings to try to force states to apply the most liberalized rules. And it's always, let's protect the right to vote. The question isn't the right to vote. The question is whether or not these people are constitutionally qualified to vote, and whether the method they're voting is constitutionally qualified. No one's interfering in a constitutionally qualified person casting a ballot in a constitutionally qualified manner. Instead, it's some slow to act voter registrars in Pennsylvania who aren't registering voters because the good governor there, Shapiro, thought that he was going to register everybody when they did their driver's license. What he did not anticipate, like they didn't anticipate in a bunch of states, is who would end up benefiting from that voter registration. And it's the reason why a bunch of counties, I suspect, are now going a little bit slow getting those voters on the voter rolls, is because they're disproportionately Republican. That, the low propensity voter is a Trump voter in 2024. It's a complete, the new voter is a Trump voter in 2024. It's a complete reversal of all Democratic Party assumptions. And that's why the party that's all about let's maximize registration and everything else is suddenly going slow in some of those capacities, while they're trying to keep the rolls padded with people who are just not constitutionally qualified to be registered to vote. It's going to be an ongoing battle. We'll see how all the cases ultimately filter out. For the most part, good law has come out of the cases, but not universally.
I do not understand how they discovered this glitch. The guy who discovered it was Richard, the one who testified during Carrie Lake's trial. The guy who said that there were never any issues with the voting discovers a glitch that since 1996, they have upwards 100,000 people who are indicated to have shown proof of a citizenship when getting their license, which they did not or may not have. And the judge comes in and says 98,000 is not that much, and it was a 10,570 some odd difference between Biden and Trump in 2020. Wild. Okay, so that's Arizona. That decision, they both appealed that decision, so that one goes up. Is that going to be heard? I mean,
so we'll see if the Arizona Supreme Court gets involved or not. There'll be court cases all the way through because these issues are just being litigated every which way. So Democracy Docket, which is a leftist group, but they do publish almost all the election cases. You get to see their briefs. You get to see the underlying work.
Democracy Docket is that's Mark Elias's
Mark Elias affiliated associated group, and so they give their spin. But just you can ignore the spin, and you can see what the court orders are, see what the rulings are. The Republican aligned lawyers have been better than 2020, not as good as they need to be. So some of the criticisms are fair criticisms. Some of the criticisms go too far because they haven't been as bad as 2020, but they're not as good as Trump thinks they are. As Trump thinks there's a bunch of lawyers lined up to do election challenges everywhere. Since I know a lot of the best lawyers in that space, and none of them have been contacted, I can tell you that hasn't happened. So there are still big gaps inside the operation, but there the criticism is well warranted. But there's also, that is not to be dismissive of a lot of the good work that's gone on in a bunch of the jurisdictions.
Other election lawsuits.
There's about a half dozen, but that covers the broad strokes. There's about a half dozen significant ones. I think there's currently 50 election law related cases pending in America today.
The issues that were the determinant issue in 2020 are not going to be the same. You haven't changed your assessment based on applications for mail-in voting, mail-in balloting. The requests are still down. The numbers haven't changed, and it doesn't look good for Democrats.
Yeah, the method by which they were able to pad the voter rolls in constitutionally questionable ways primarily concerned mail-in balloting. Even when the issue was whether the person who voted was constitutionally qualified, that voter was almost exclusively voting by mail. The most questionable ballots were mail-in ballots, and the ballots that were not properly counted and canvassed in a constitutionally correct manner were overwhelmingly mail-in ballots. So the big issue is still primarily and principally mail-in balloting. But you need mail-in ballots to harvest. You need voters on the rolls that you can count on to report them voting, and they are in bad shape. The Democrats are on both of those accords.